was broke, desperate, and about to lose everything when I helped a homeless man outside a gas station. That $5 act of kindness seemed meaningless at the time. I had no idea that stranger would become my business partner, and together we'd build $1 billion empire. This is our story. If you've ever wondered how one small gesture can change your entire life, stick around, because this story will blow your mind. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of kindness, and let's dive in. Let me take you back to 2019. I was 28 years old, living in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Seattle, and I was failing spectacularly at life. My startup, a food delivery app that I'd poured 3 years and every penny I had into, was circling the drain. The ramen noodles I ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner weren't a lifestyle choice. They were survival. My credit cards were maxed out. My student loans were in default. And the woman I thought I'd marry had moved out 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind nothing but a note that said I was chasing impossible dreams. But I had one last shot. One final investor meeting that could save everything. I'd rehearsed my pitch 1,000 times in the mirror, wearing the same wrinkled shirt I'd been wearing to every meeting for months, because it was the only one that still looked halfway professional. This was it. This was my moment to turn everything around. The meeting was a disaster from the first handshake. The investor, a gray-haired man in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, listened to my pitch with the kind of polite disinterest you reserve for telemarketers. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and delivered the words that still echo in my mind today. "Your idea is worthless," he said, not even bothering to soften the blow. "You're naive if you think this market has room for another player. Save yourself the embarrassment and find a real job." I sat there in stunned silence as he stood up, straightened his tie, and walked out of the conference room without another word. 20 minutes. 3 years of my life dismissed in 20 minutes. The drive home was a blur of rage and despair. My beat-up Honda Civic coughed and wheezed through downtown traffic, while my phone buzzed incessantly with notifications I couldn't bear to check. Overdue rent notices, credit card companies, my mother, probably calling to ask if I'd come to my senses yet, and applied for that accounting job she'd been pushing. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of the city, my fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. I reached into my wallet and counted the bills. $23. That was it. That was all I had left in the world. $23 between me and complete financial ruin. As I filled up my tank, watching the numbers climb on the pump display, I noticed him. An older man, maybe in his 50s, sitting against the brick wall of the gas station. His clothes were worn and dirty, his hair unkempt, and he was shivering in the cold Seattle drizzle. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something there that I recognized, the hollow look of someone who'd lost hope. I finished pumping gas and walked toward the convenience store, my $23 feeling heavy in my pocket. The smart thing, the logical thing, would be to buy myself a cheap meal and save the rest for tomorrow. I needed every penny. But as I passed the homeless man, something inside me broke. "Hey," I said, stopping in front of him. "When's the last time you ate?" He looked up at me with surprise, as if he wasn't used to people actually speaking to him. "Yesterday morning, I think," he said quietly. His voice was educated, articulate, Not what I'd expected. Without thinking, I walked into the store and bought 2 hot dogs, a bag of chips, and a large coffee. It cost me $8, money I couldn't afford to spend, but as I handed the food to the man, watching his face light up with gratitude, something shifted inside me. "I'm Eddie," he said, unwrapping the first hot dog with shaking hands. "Eddie Chen." "I'm Marcus," I replied, crouching down to his level. "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" We sat there on the cold concrete, sharing an unlikely moment of connection. Eddie ate slowly, savoring each bite, and we talked. He told me he'd been on the streets for about 2 years, that he'd made some mistakes in his previous life. When I mentioned my failed business meeting, he listened with an intensity that caught me off guard. "You know," Eddie said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I used to work in tech, saw a lot of startups come and go." I nodded politely, assuming he was just trying to relate to my situation. Homeless people often claimed prestigious past lives. It was a way of maintaining dignity in an undignified situation. But then he said something that would haunt me for months afterward. "Sometimes, the best investments are in people, not products. When you find someone with real character, someone who'll help a stranger when they can barely help themselves, that's worth more than any business plan." I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too wrapped up in my own problems to really hear what he was saying. We finished our impromptu meal. I wished him well, and drove home to my empty apartment, where I spent the night staring at the ceiling and wondering if it was time to give up on my dreams. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. Bright pink paper taped to my door, like a scarlet letter of failure. I had 30 days to come up with 3 months' back rent, or find myself on the street. The irony wasn't lost on me that I might soon be sitting next to Eddie on that gas station wall. My girlfriend Sarah called that same evening. I thought maybe she'd reconsidered. Maybe she wanted to work things out. Instead, she was calling to get her name off our shared Netflix account. "I'm worried about you, Marcus," she said, but her voice was distant, detached. "Everyone's worried about you. Maybe it's time to admit this isn't working out and find something stable." "I'm not giving up," I told her, even though the words felt hollow in my mouth. "That's what I'm afraid of," she replied, and hung up. My parents stopped returning my calls. My college friends stopped inviting me to their dinner parties, where they'd show off their new houses and talk about their 401k contributions. I was becoming the cautionary tale, the guy who threw away a promising career to chase a pipe dream. But the strangest things started happening. I kept running into Eddie around the city, not at the gas station, but in coffee shops, at the library, walking through downtown. Each time, he'd ask about my business with genuine interest, offering insights that seemed surprisingly sophisticated for someone living on the streets. "Have you considered pivoting your customer acquisition strategy?" he asked one afternoon when I found him reading a newspaper outside the public library. "Sometimes when the direct approach isn't working, you need to find the side door." I started looking forward to these random encounters. Eddie became the only person in my life who still believed in my idea, who still treated me like an entrepreneur instead of a failure. He'd ask probing questions about my technology, my market research, my competition. His questions were better than most of the investors I'd pitched to. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Is this Marcus Thompson?" The voice was professional, crisp. "Yes, this is Marcus." My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an attorney representing a private investor who's interested in funding your startup. I nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, what? My client prefers to remain anonymous for now, but they've reviewed your business plan and would like to make an offer. Are you available to meet tomorrow afternoon? I spent that entire night pacing my apartment, hardly believing it was real. An anonymous investor. How had they even heard about my failed startup? I'd been rejected by everyone in Seattle's tech scene. The meeting was in a downtown law office that screamed money and success. Jennifer Walsh was exactly what I'd expected. Sharp suit, sharper smile, and a contract that seemed too good to be true. The investor wanted to provide enough funding to get my app off the ground, plus a living stipend for me. The terms were generous, almost suspiciously so, but there was one strange condition buried in the legal language. I had to hire Eddie Chen as a business consultant. I'm sorry, I said, looking up from the contract. Did you say Eddie Chen? That's correct. My client was very specific about this requirement. Mr. Chen is to be brought on as a consultant for your startup. Is this a problem? I stared at the contract, my mind racing. It had to be a coincidence. Eddie Chen was probably a common name, but still, the timing was bizarre. Can I ask why this Eddie Chen specifically? Jennifer's smile never wavered, but her eyes gave nothing away. My client believes Mr. Chen's insights would be valuable to your venture. Will you be accepting the offer? I was desperate enough to accept almost any condition, and if it meant giving my homeless friend Eddie a paying job, maybe that was just karma working in mysterious ways. I signed the contract that afternoon, feeling like I'd just made a deal with the devil. But at least it was a well-funded devil. Finding Eddie to tell him about the job offer should have been harder than it was. But the next morning, there he was, sitting at the same gas station where we'd first met, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Eddie," I called out, jogging over to him. "I have incredible news." When I told him about the anonymous investor and the consulting position, his reaction was oddly subdued. No surprise, no excitement, just a knowing nod, as if he'd been expecting this conversation. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. "And you're sure they specifically asked for me?" That's the weird part. They insisted on Eddie Chen specifically. I know it's probably just a coincidence, but... "There are no coincidences in business," Eddie interrupted, meeting my eyes with an intensity I'd never seen before. "When do we start?" Working with Eddie was like having a secret weapon. Within our first week together, he'd identified 3 critical flaws in my business model that had taken me months to miss. He suggested pivots and strategies that were so sophisticated, so precisely targeted, that I started wondering where a homeless man had learned advanced business theory. Our app began gaining traction almost immediately. Eddie seemed to have connections everywhere. He'd mention our startup to someone at a coffee shop, and suddenly, we'd have a meeting with a potential partner. He'd make a casual phone call, and major food chains would agree to pilot our platform. "How do you know all these people?" I asked him one afternoon, after he'd somehow arranged a partnership with a restaurant group that had been ignoring my emails for months. Eddie just smiled. "You meet interesting people when you pay attention to the world around you." But I was starting to pay attention too, and what I noticed didn't add up. Eddie's homeless friends weren't what they seemed. The guy he introduced as Tony from the shelter was wearing a Rolex underneath his worn jacket sleeve. The woman he claimed was another person down on her luck, spoke with the confident tone of someone used to running board meetings. I started noticing other things too. Eddie would receive phone calls in what sounded like Mandarin and Korean, speaking with the fluency of someone who'd lived in those countries. Once, when he thought I wasn't looking, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a very expensive smartphone hidden beneath his simple flip phone. The business was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Within 3 months, we had partnerships with major restaurant chains, a user base in the tens of thousands, and venture capital firms calling us instead of the other way around. It should have been the happiest time of my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in someone else's story. Late one night, alone in our small office, I decided to do some research. I started with a simple Google search: Eddie Chen, tech entrepreneur, Seattle. What I found made my blood run cold. Edward Chen, former CEO of a major tech company, lost everything in a scandal involving misappropriated funds. Though he'd been cleared of all charges, his reputation was destroyed. The articles were from 3 years ago. According to the timeline, he would have lost his company right around the time he said he'd ended up on the streets. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The photos from his corporate days showed a man in expensive suits, standing confidently in boardrooms and conference halls, clean-shaven, well-groomed, successful. It was unmistakably Eddie, but a version of Eddie I'd never seen. I spent hours diving deeper into the research, finding fragments of a story that made my head spin. Edward Chen hadn't just been any tech CEO. He'd been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His company had revolutionized mobile commerce in Asia before expanding to the U.S. market. And then, almost overnight, it had all come crashing down. The scandal had been brutal and public. Accusations of financial misconduct, federal investigations, business partners turning on him. Even though he was eventually cleared of all charges, the damage was done. His company collapsed. His personal fortune evaporated in legal fees and settlements, and his reputation was destroyed. But if Eddie was Edward Chen, then what was he doing living on the streets? And more importantly, what was he doing working as my consultant? A man who'd built $100 million company didn't need a job with a struggling startup, unless he was the anonymous investor. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, as all the pieces fell into place. The mysterious funding, the insistence on hiring Eddie specifically, his impossible connections and sophisticated business insights, his lack of surprise when I'd offered him the consulting position. I'd been played. But why? What did Edward Chen want with me and my small startup? And why had he been living on the streets when he could have had any life he wanted? I couldn't sleep that night. Every interaction with Eddie replayed in my mind with new context. The way he'd eaten that gas station hot dog with such gratitude. Was that real? Or part of an elaborate performance? The wisdom he'd shared about investing in people over products. Had that been a test? The next morning, I confronted him in our office. Eddie was sitting at his desk, reviewing partnership agreements with the focused intensity I'd come to recognize. But now, I saw it differently. This wasn't a homeless man grateful for a second chance. This was a former CEO operating in his natural element. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tighter than I'd intended. Eddie looked up slowly, and something in his expression told me he'd been expecting this moment. "I wondered when you'd figure it out." "You're Edward Chen. The Edward Chen, former CEO of Mobi Commerce Asia." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, Edward, let his mask slip. The humble, grateful demeanor disappeared, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "Yes," he said simply, "I am. So this whole thing, the homelessness, the random encounters, the mysterious investor, it was all an elaborate setup." Edward stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. 3 years ago, I lost everything. Not just my money. That was the easy part. I lost my reputation, my relationships, my sense of who I was. The scandal destroyed more than my company. It destroyed my faith in people. He turned back to face me, and I saw something raw in his eyes. I was cleared of all charges because I was innocent. But innocence doesn't matter when the court of public opinion has already decided your guilt. Former partners wouldn't return my calls. Friends crossed the street to avoid me. My own board of directors, people I'd made millionaires, testified against me to save their own reputations. "So you ended up on the streets?" "I chose the streets," Edward corrected. "I had enough money hidden away to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But I needed to understand something. I needed to know if there were still people in this world who would show kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return." The weight of his words settled over me. The gas station was real. Everything about that moment was real. I'd been living homeless for 2 years. Not because I had to, but because I was searching for something. Searching for proof that genuine human decency still existed. Edward walked back to his desk and pulled out a folder I'd never seen before. Inside were photographs, documents, what looked like surveillance reports. I wasn't just randomly testing people, Marcus. I'd been watching you for months before that night. I knew about your failed meetings, your financial struggles, your relationship problems. I knew you had $23 in your wallet when you walked into that gas station. My legs felt weak. I sank into the chair across from his desk. You were watching me. I was studying you. Your business plan had reached my desk through a contact, someone who thought I might find it interesting. But I don't invest in ideas anymore, Marcus. I invest in character. So I did my research. Edward opened the folder and showed me photographs of myself I'd never seen. Me leaving investor meetings looking dejected. Me at the grocery store, counting change at the checkout. Me sitting alone in coffee shops, working on my laptop with the desperate intensity of someone running out of options. I watched you for 3 months. I saw how you treated service workers when you were stressed. I noticed that you still left tips at restaurants, even when you were barely eating. I observed how you spoke about your competitors, with respect, not bitterness. You were failing, but you were failing with integrity. So the gas station encounter was a test. The gas station was my moment of truth. I'd been living on those streets for 2 years, and I'd encountered thousands of people. Most ignored me completely. Some threw spare change without making eye contact. A few were actively cruel. But you saw me as a human being. You sacrificed money you desperately needed because you believed I needed it more. Edward closed the folder and looked directly at me. That night, I knew I'd found what I was looking for. Someone whose character remained intact under pressure. Someone who would invest in a stranger's dignity, even when they couldn't afford to invest in themselves. The room fell silent except for the hum of traffic outside our window. I felt like I was seeing Edward clearly for the first time. Not the homeless man who'd needed my help, not the mysterious consultant who'd guided my business, but the broken billionaire who'd been searching for proof that good people still existed. So you've been the anonymous investor this whole time. From the moment you walked away from that gas station, I had my lawyers draft the investment agreement that same week. The consulting requirement wasn't to give Eddie Chen a job. It was to give Edward Chen a chance to rebuild. Rebuild what? My faith in partnership. My belief that business could be about more than just profit. My hope that I could trust someone again. Edward pulled out another document from his desk drawer. This one looked official, stamped and notarized. Which brings me to why I'm telling you all this now. Marcus, in the 6 months we've been working together, you've never once tried to take credit for ideas that weren't yours. You've never asked about the identity of your mysterious investor, or tried to go behind my back to cut a better deal. You've treated Eddie the consultant with the same respect you showed Eddie the homeless man. He slid the document across the desk to me. Your company is now worth $1.2 billion. The partnerships I've helped arrange, the technology improvements we've implemented, the market positioning we've achieved, it's all real value, not just speculation. And I want to offer you something that no one offered me when I was building my first company. I looked down at the document. It was a partnership agreement, but not like any I'd ever seen. A true 50-50 partnership, Edward continued. Equal ownership, equal decision-making, equal everything. This was always the plan, Marcus. From the moment you spent your last $8 feeding a stranger, this was where I hoped we'd end up. I stared at the papers, my hands shaking. I don't understand. You could have rebuilt your fortune a dozen different ways. Why me? Why this? Edward smiled, and for the first time, it was the same genuine smile I'd seen on Eddie's face that night at the gas station. Because you proved something I'd stopped believing. You proved that success built on character is the only success worth having. And because I learned something during those 2 years on the streets that no boardroom ever taught me. Sometimes the best business decision you can make is to bet everything on human decency. Signing that partnership agreement was the easiest decision I'd ever made. Not because of the money, though I'd be lying if I said becoming a billionaire overnight wasn't surreal, but because I finally understood what Edward had been building all along. We weren't just partners in a billion-dollar company. We were proof of concept for something much more valuable. The idea that business could be a force for discovering and rewarding the best in people, rather than exploiting their weaknesses. The first thing we did with our success was return to that gas station, not for publicity or social media content, but because it felt right. We set up a foundation that provides not just meals and shelter for homeless individuals, but business training and seed funding for those ready to rebuild their lives. Edward told me later that 12 people had passed him that night before I stopped. 12 opportunities for someone else to change both of our lives with a simple act of kindness. I think about that sometimes. How different everything would have been if I'd walked past like everyone else, too wrapped up in my own problems to see his. But the deeper lesson wasn't about the reward for kindness. It was about the power of authenticity. Edward had spent 2 years testing the character of strangers because he'd learned, in the most painful way possible, that success without integrity is just elaborate failure waiting to happen. Our company continues to grow, but we've built it on principles that would have seemed naive to my younger self. We pay our employees above market rate. We share profits with everyone who contributes to our success. We turn down partnerships with companies that don't align with our values, even when it costs us millions. And you know what? It works. It works better than any strategy I learned in business school or read about in entrepreneurship books. When you build something on genuine respect for human dignity, when you invest in people's potential instead of just exploiting their labor, you create something that's not just profitable. You create something that's sustainable. Edward and I still have coffee together every morning before work. Sometimes we talk about business strategy or market trends. But more often, we talk about the people we've met, the stories they've shared, the small acts of courage and kindness we've witnessed. He told me once that finding me at that gas station didn't just save his faith in humanity, it saved his life. He'd been preparing to disappear entirely, to retreat to some remote place where he could live out his days without the risk of being disappointed by people again. But I think he saved mine too. Not financially, though obviously that part has been life-changing. He saved me from becoming someone who only sees the world in terms of transactions and opportunities. He showed me that the best investments really are in people, and that character isn't just nice to have. It's the foundation that everything else is built on. That $5 meal became a $1 billion lesson that I carry with me every day. Eddie taught me that success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about who you become along the way. And sometimes, when you're willing to see the humanity in a stranger, when you're willing to invest in someone's dignity, even when you can barely afford to invest in yourself, the universe has a way of noticing. If this story inspired you to believe in the power of kindness, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove miracles happen when we least expect them. What act of kindness changed your life? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might just inspire the next video. Next week, I'll share how a single tweet from a stranger saved my friend's dying business and turned him into a millionaire. You won't believe what happened when he decided to respond with gratitude instead of suspicion. Until then, remember, you never know who might change your life, and you never know whose life you might change. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see someone who feels invisible.